Good day everyone, the Anime Down is back with another video. In this one, we are going back to donghua, but we will be talking about web novels that I would like to see animated. I will also give a brief explanation of the genres each novel in the list is. But before we start, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to keep the channel going. So that's it with the chit chat, let's get to the video. The first novel I will be talking about is from the genre referred to as jihuan. Jihuan means fantasy, but it is associated with Western fantasy on Chinese platforms. So it usually has Western dragons, dwarves, elves, and all that stuff. Conquest is a series that has one of the most views in Qidian. It's not a recent novel, in fact it is from 2009 and it ended back in 2012, over 10 years ago now. The author behind this series is Dancing, or Tiao Wu, a well-known web novel author that has many other works under his belt. Another work of his, called Law of the Devil, is getting animated. Conquest came after Law of the Devil and they are the most popular titles penned by Tiao Wu so far. The fact it's a Western fantasy series is likely to work to its benefit, as a significant number of xuanhuan have been animated so far, so they are likely to turn to some of the popular Western fantasy series eventually. And Conquest is one of the most popular series, as well as one of the best series out there when it comes to Western fantasy in Chinese platforms. Conquest's story takes place in a normal Western fantasy setting that involves various kingdoms and empires that are often at odds with each other over territory and resources. In addition, there are fantastical things like dragons, elves, and other creatures that are a staple of Western epic fantasy. It is not the setting or world building that makes Conquest the enjoyable read it is, but the characters, most notably the main character. Shar Thunder, the main character, is raised by an old drunk that picked him up when he was a child. The old drunk and Shar lived on the outskirts of a small village and lived strictly off their hunting. The old drunk taught and trained Shar in many things, mostly hunting and martial arts, before eventually dropping dead. However, their secluded lifestyle and poverty left Shar without common sense or understanding of how life was outside the small village. In short, he was a complete country bumpkin, whose childhood of hunting had shaped into a hulking man, but one that often was clueless, or at least it seems that way, about things outside fighting. However, over the novel, Shar's character develops, but the comedy coming from his often crazy attitude and actions never ceases. Shar and the comedic edge he brings adds a component to the otherwise dark and violent world that we are shown. It works as a form of comedic relief that acts to space out the tense, dramatic, action-packed scenes. Don't go thinking this is simply comedy, because it does develop into high adrenaline action as Shar seeks to rise up in the ranks of the military after leaving the village and getting dragged into joining the army. Conquest is all about Shar and his contest not in wars but also of many women, but he has weird tastes, so keep that in mind. I definitely see this getting animated eventually, and it would be great to see it. Next, we have a xuanhuan novel. Xuanhuan is the genre I explored in my other video. I will link it in the description below if you want to know more about it. However, in short, xuanhuan is Eastern fantasy, but it can blend various elements that can go from sci-fi to Western fantasy, so keep that in mind. The Outcast is one of Mao Ni's earlier works. Many of his works have received adaptations like Xie Tianji, Evernight, and Joy of Life. The Outcast is still waiting for any sort of adaptation, and I am as well. Mao Ni is one of my favorite web novel authors because of his focus on shaping the background for his story and evolving it into a contrived plot. Many other xuanhuan tend to focus more singularly on the main character, with the world getting shaped around him. Mao Ni makes his main character actually feel like they are part of the world and not the one that drives it. So how is the world in The Outcast, you might ask? The Outcast has a science fantasy setting, which is unusual for a Xuanhuan series. The story starts in a backwards region in a little star in the universe called Eastward, where a group of hoodlums live in the slums of their city. A respected resident of the slums, Shule, acts like a sort of leader of the other hoodlums, and he tries to keep them out of trouble with the authorities of the city. However, he has a dream to leave the slums and become an engineer in the army of the Empire that governs not only the little star they live in, but also many other universes. In order to achieve this dream, he has to become able to pass their rigid test and the prejudice they have towards people of origin like his. In his early teens, Shule happens to stumble into a stranger living in the slums that seems to be incredibly capable when it comes to engineering. Shule is quick to beg the stranger, who lives sloppily, to become his mentor, and he begrudgingly accepts. Learning from the man, Shule finds himself changing, and at the same time his involvement with him would eventually change his world. The background of the story is simple to begin with, but the tiny world that Shule knows changes overnight after an accident. From there the world builds up quickly, and we gradually get to know the social, cultural and political structures of the world which Shule is just a tiny speck in. So all in all, I believe The Outcast has an interesting world, a decent cast of characters and a good story. I do hope it gets some sort of adaptation like his other works. For this next series, I will keep the genre a mystery, but I imagine you might be quite familiar with it. Little Tyrant doesn't want to meet with a bad end. It's not a Xuanhuan, Jihuan, or Keshuan. It's what we call an isekai fantasy. What this means is that the story has at its core the isekai element. What is the difference, you might ask? Before I explain, let me talk about the story of Little Tyrant, which might give you a hint of what I mean. The main character wakes up in the body of Roel Ascart, who is a villainous character from a Gao game that the main character had played during his life. Naturally, reincarnating in the body of a fictional villain character might make one apprehensive, especially as Roel Ascart dies a horrible death in the game. Seeing that he needed to change that fate, the main character, who has time on his side as he reincarnates just in the beginning of the game when Roel Ascart is still only a child. So he moves to quickly change his fate by faking a change of heart and to transform his character into a good person. This changes his whole relationship with the main heroines from how it was in the game. One of the main heroines was taken up by his father as a child, and she sort of became a stepsister for him, and in the original story, Roel Ascart bullied her horribly, and in the end she was one of his killers. So he acts instead like a nice brother figure to her, and that might have unintended consequences in the future. The element of isekai fantasy here is the reincarnation into a Gao game setting. It transforms the story from something that could be a western fantasy with an isekai plot device to a story crafted around the isekai plotline. The distinction is that the main character and story is driven by his knowledge of the characters, settings, and goals of the game, so the isekai element ends up dictating the plotline. In this instance, he wants to avoid his death and avoid trouble, but what perhaps he has not realized is that if a linear game is made into a world, then many things unseen in the main game storyline also become part of the real world too. So whilst the main character's memory can be quite convenient for the author if he wants to, there's no way he will know stuff that was not part of the linear story of the game. So there's a trick there for the author. Little Tyrant might seem like a Japanese novel, and it would not be strange to think that. Gao games are associated mainly with Japan. A reincarnation into this sort of stories are seen more so in Japanese stories. The Japanese influence is not that strange when you see that this series is published in Siwei Mao, that I have spoken about in my Xuanhuan video. The link is in the description. Siwei Mao features many stories influenced by Japanese light novels. Little Tyrant is just one of them, and it's one of the most enjoyable to read, and it's very popular as well, which makes I believe a future anime adaptation is quite probable, especially since its manhwa adaptation is also doing rather well. Next is xianxia. Xianxia is another genre that I explained in my web novel video. The link, as I mentioned previously, is in the description down below. A direct translation of xianxia means immortal hero. But in short, xianxia are Taoist fantasy stories that involve the journey to immortality of the main character, more often than not. Legend of the Cultivation God is my xianxia pick for this video. It was one of the only xianxia that when I first read, it felt unlike any other novel in the genre. It began back in 2010, but it's still ongoing and currently has over 10,000 chapters. Chinese web novels usually have a lot of chapters, but a number of chapters that high is not normal for even Chinese novels. A large part of this length is of course due to its popularity, and also because the author actually takes his time to build up the main character and the world. Legend of the Cultivation God starts in a small village, where the main character, Jiang Xiaohua, lives alongside his family. What differs it from other xianxia novels is that Xiaohua is actually a child that stumbles onto a strange stone bracelet one day. However, that does not immediately result in him starting to cultivate or anything. In fact, the very idea of cultivation is something completely absent from their mortal lives. In actuality, that makes more sense, as the cultivation word in Taoism is a word that is essentially separate from the mortal one, so a mortal should have no idea about the word of cultivation for the most part. The bracelet does not cause any change to Xiaohua's life, or so it seems. Hence we continue to see the life of Xiaohua, as the author is keen to show how he experiences the natural changes going on within his household as he grows into his teenage years. By taking his time to showcase this growing up period that shapes Xiaohua's idea of his place in the world and his personality, the author makes the audience gain a deep understanding of his character. Xiaohua in his teenage years has to gradually set a path for him to take for his future. Alongside his brothers, he ends up trying to train in the way of martial arts. However, the master there finds that he has low talent for it. But Xiaohua's caring and persistent personality means he's not willing to push him away. At the same time that this is happening, the author starts to expand the world and introduce the wuxia world, Jianghu, through various other characters, and we are left wondering how the main character will actually enter this world. From my description of the story so far, you might be thinking that this is a wuxia story and not a xianxia. You would not be wrong to think that, after all. The cultivation aspect present in xianxia stories, often from the very beginning, takes a significant amount of time to show up here. It's a natural progression from the wuxia world into the cultivation world, and that works because of the deep world building and character progression of Xiaohua, from being simply a poor mortal at the beginning to a martial artist and eventually a cultivator, and we are the ones to see through his legend. So those were my picks for web novels that I would like to see animated. You can take them as predictions for stuff that will be animated in the future as well. If you liked any of the titles, or have any you would like to see animated too, please comment down below. And before you leave, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. Catch you guys later.